right, it's now 28 minutes to 8. This is Kivumbi 2017, and right now we'd just like to go straight into a conversation right here in studio, and let me introduce the guest that I have this morning. I have Delano Kiilu, who's the Secretary General for Protective and Safety Association of Kenya. We also have Tuta Richard, Homeland Security expert. Good morning, gentlemen, and thank you for joining us. Now, you've seen the reporters that we have reached out to in different parts of the country, and more so the Nyanza area, where there was a bit of trouble yesterday, especially as IEBC had insisted that the elections were going to take place, but after the chair postponed and said that that's not going to happen and give us a new date, calm seems to have returned. Maybe let me start with you, just your assessment on that particular change of events just by that announcement.
I think the bone of contention, Mike, has been taken out of the way, and the bone of contention really was enforcing an electoral process on a general populace that was not interested in an election according to their rules. So in this particular case, the bone of contention, which was a repeat of the presidential elections in those particular areas where the political leaders had clearly said they will not vote in those particular areas, that bone of contention has been taken away. However, it did lead to quite a large number of incidents last night. We actually had people on the road, and we had people having to drive through over 20 different roadblocks and pay illegal toll fees to the youth who had gathered along the Kisumu-Nairobi road. So in many of these areas, what we are seeing is the perpetration of lawlessness, and that cannot exist in a modern society, and actually fuels the fires for other kinds of malpractices. So yes, we are seeing a de-escalation, but that de-escalation this morning doesn't give us the true picture. We do know and are aware that currently, there is a bit of a food crisis in those areas because the areas are not self-sustaining. They receive supplies, milk from as far away as Nandi, foodstuffs from Kericho and the Kisii areas. And when all these roadblocks are put up, the people who supply cities like Kisumu do not then move their goods and produce because of fear of loss of property and loss of life. So, in other words, right now, normalcy is resuming, but it's not calm normalcy due to the elections being postponed further or being cancelled in these particular areas. It's actually because basic human living is now being affected. Somebody has to eat, somebody has to drink, and somebody has to sleep. So we would certainly urge from the Protective and Safety Association of Kenya that all Kenyans should de-escalate. We should be over and done with the electoral process, because it is a process that we are currently walking through, and allow for procedures to take place and redress through legal means as previously, rather than taking the law into our own hands to go after seemingly ways of solving the problem. Again, one of the big issues we have this morning is that we have a political class that is no longer concerned about the lives of civilians, the civil populace, or we can call it the mwananchi, the man on the ground, the man who lives on 100 shillings a day economy, and who right now, for many reasons, with the electoral process, is unable to make a living or is unable to fend for himself or his family. That particular mwananchi on the ground is suffering. And these may have become pawns to a larger political game that unfortunately is leading to the loss of life. And really, we want to condole with every single family that has lost a family member over the last couple of days. I think the loss of life and even injuries should not be something that we should accept as Kenyans as normal during an electoral process. This should be condemned in the strongest terms possible, and the leaders, particularly leaders who have taken very hard stances in this matter, should actually go to the ground and meet with individuals who have either been injured or meet with families who are mourning loss of life. And where we have flare-ups, I'm really encouraging that we shouldn't see a scenario where leaders are staying away, because currently leaders are sending forth their followers into the fray and staying very far in the background. This is not fair on, the normal lives of Kenyans.
Of Kenyans, for them to carry on. Let me come to you, Tuta, and you bring in an interesting aspect, because one of the questions I was asking myself yesterday is that, yes, the opposition leaders did say that people should not come out. They should stay home and not go out and vote. However, with all the press conferences that we were seeing, there was hardly anything to address the current state of things and reminding their followers that they should stay home, because at the end of the day, it looked like it was going down. But maybe just your comments, first of all, on the fact that the bone of contention, which was the election, has been removed and somewhat normalcy seems to be returning.
Maybe just to start with what you have asked, is that you never had the political class, and especially from the NASA, telling their supporters.
They did, but towards the end.
They did. And if at all they did, then what is coming up clearly is that, like an example that we have always have all over the world, of leaderless jihad, whereby now it reaches a point that those who are engaging in act of violence are like an example that I can give. They are on autopilot now, because we have heard from the NASA leadership, and especially even yesterday, telling their supporters to remain indoor. But immediately when you go to the ground, what you see is differently. So that one tells you something, that what we are being treated to can be a case of leaderless violence group. Secondly is that sociologists or social scientists will ask the relationship between election and violence in some of these areas. That is it violence that is dependent on election, or is it that election is dependent on violence? Because the moment yesterday IEBC chair said that there are not going to be election in some of these areas, you can see that almost 90% of security problems were solved instantly. So that one tells you, because to me that was a very good strategy, which we normally say that you can also win a war without a fight. And you can see now there is no fight in any of the mentioned counties.
Let's go back to what you've mentioned here on leaderless violence and leaderless masses that seem to be doing contrary to what they have been advised.
Yes.
Is that something we should be worried about? Because then we would expect, if this indeed are NASA supporters and they're out because they feel passionately that they are disenfranchised because their leader is not on the ballot or has said stay away, then at the point where the leader says stay home, don't come out, and that is for safety reasons, then they still do that, should we be concerned about that?
We should be concerned unless their leaders are telling them, are telling us what they mean.
Unless it's doublespeak.
It is a doublespeak. But if it is not doublespeak, then that is what I've said, that it's just like a case of a leaderless jihad. Secondly, the things that we need to ask ourselves now, that do we continue containing the situation the way we have been containing it? Because you cannot fight groups like, for instance, terrorism, if at all you don't have knowledge about the psychology and the anatomy of a terrorist organization. So we call upon the police now to start now studying the psychology behind some of these acts of riots, because sometimes what motivates them is not what motivates other aspects of criminals. So that if you contain them, or if you develop a strategy similar to the strategies that you use to contain normal crime, you may not. But the police have an option to come up with a well-defined strategy on how they will be countering riots, or to go for a quick fix. And a quick fix here, I mean, is that where you unleash live bullets, where you unleash what we have been treated to. Or they may opt to change and to say, yes, we have been doing this before, and the more we do it, it has always been escalating. So why can't we rechange our strategy?
Okay.
And you see now, as we are talking, there is the issue of a conflict between securing some of these areas and issues to do with human rights. And these are issues that need to be looked at. Which one should the police sacrifice? Should they sacrifice the issues to do with human rights in containing riot, or should they reach at an equilibrium somewhere?
All right. Delano, looking at you've talked about psychology, the psychology of, you know, the crowd that is doing this. And sometimes you brought up something interesting here in the fact that when those roads are blocked, we have other issues that come up, things to do possibly, say, with food supply for that area. I mean, in some of the pictures, we even saw places where they were literally yanking off the road rail and welding it, literally, to block that road, which from one perspective, one may say is very myopic in terms of, okay, fine, you have stopped IEBC from coming in, but what about emergency services, for example, which could be for your relative? What about food supplies, which are required for you to live? What is the psychology working behind this? Is it that the leaders possibly have given them a very small view of what this is all about, or there's no understanding fully?
Mike, I think you're very right. In looking at those kind of barricades, illegal roadblocks that have been put up, we say in the battle theater, you're cutting off MSRs, or main supply routes.
Correct.
And when you do that, you choke whoever is cut off from basic services. We actually do have evidence of many people who are on chronic care, who are unable to be evacuated to hospital, even within Kisumu. Why? Because the youth are saying nobody should move. So there are actually people who are at risk of loss of life from very simple illnesses like diabetes, etc., who cannot access even health services. But just going back into the psychology of the thing, I think I would want to just, you know, maybe differ slightly with what, you know, Richard Tuta said here in terms of the police dealing with the scenario. If we go to a deal scenario, unfortunately, because of the makeup of the police, the deal scenario is not a very pleasant scenario. And this is anywhere around the world. A deal scenario will always result in some kind of confrontation or friction that is not healthy to whoever is going to be dealt with. I think if we analyze, and we received reports from very many different places. For example, we've received reports that the Bungoma activity that occurred yesterday was actually imported individuals, not normal residents of Bungoma. And right now, I actually have somebody who has had to sleep in Kandui, who was staying in the main part of Bungoma town, who could not access and get to where he needed to rest. So Muskoma Kandui Road was really a no-go zone yesterday. And in other parts, we have also had issues and incidents related to this. But it's very, very basic. Every single attack that you see, mark my words, every single attack that you see has been planned. According to the cycle of attack, somebody actually comes up with a plan, finances that plan, looks at their best strategy to be able to deploy and execute on that plan,
Let's
and
get
looks
this
at the
clear.
objective.
When you talk about the attack, are you talking about the attack from the security forces' point of view, or even those who are putting blockades?
I'm talking about when you see any confrontation that involves violence in this country. I'm not talking about the security forces defending and protecting their line. I'm talking about where you see protesters turning, instead of picketing, turning into stone throwers or using catapults. We had a policeman who was very severely injured yesterday on the mouth by somebody who used the catapult, and the mouth shattered his jaw. Where you see that turning into that, there's somebody who planned and said, this is what we will use. These will be our weapons of choice. This is how we will provoke them. This is going to be our standoff area. This is how far back we're going to push them. So and so is going to be allocated to bring the tires. So and so will bring the wood, like what you're saying, the welding of barricades. Somebody was the welder over there. We identify so and so as the welder. So I think police need to go one step further into actually dismantling the plan of the attack. In other words, being able to detect who are these guys who are coming up, who are the masterminds. For example, the gang violence last night and starting late evening in Kangware. That was already, we understand very clearly, that was a sponsored activity. In Nigeria, you'd call it startup. I want to agree 100% with Richard Tuta that the characteristics of these kind of activities are the things that lead to what we call domestic terrorism. So it has to be nipped in the bud. It has to be nipped very, very early, because what happens is the residents become very afraid. And I can speak on a matter of authority regarding the issue of Kangware, because I went to Kangware last night between 11 p.m. and midnight. In fact, there was absolutely no vehicle between Breban and Mwisho that whole area, Congo, that area of coast, that area of market, there was no vehicle. There was also no lights. Supermarkets burnt and that kind of scenario in Kangware. I actually assisted some residents who are from the surrounding environs to get home because there's no public transport. What happens? It means you're creating a culture of fear. Fear from a security perspective is simply terror. And where domestic terror is trying or starting to try to arise because of using the excuse of elections, I think that is something that we cannot accept as a nation. That is something that we must address, and we must address it very forcibly, and we must address it not only from a leadership perspective. I really would encourage that our political leaders and the principals in particular need to take up an immediate action to address this issue. Because if left out of hand, then we move from just this being unable to even detect the threat, because at the moment we are missing on a lot of issues. We're not detecting the threat. So we're trying to deter the threat by putting out water cannons. We're trying to deter the threat by putting out, our GSU units wearing heavy uniform, and that is no longer deterring people. So now we're ending up with dealing with the things. And when you deal, it becomes very, very messy.
All right, let me come to you, Delano. You seem to disagree a bit with him. I mean, Tuta. In terms of some of what he had to say, but also you talked about a militia, as it were, that has no leader. But I think from what you're saying, we're actually saying that as much as the leader may not be the political leaders that we're seeing speaking, there could be other leaders within the local environment that are mobilizing. Because for a group to come together, for a group to move in one motion, there has to be, even if you look at group psychology, even if they just gathered, there has to be somebody who says, look, I'm going to lead this group, and this is the direction we're going to take. This is how far we will go.
I still also want to disagree with my brother here when he mentioned the issue to do with Bungoma. Whether that person is from Bungoma or not, there is a way that every Kenyan ought to be treated. Even if you are a criminal, it is well prescribed in law. No one, and I repeat, no one is above the law, including the citizens themselves who are demonstrating, and including also the various organs of the law enforcement agencies. No one, because the moment we run away from the law, what we'll experience in this country is anarchy. It will be like what a philosopher, Thomas Hobbes, talked of lack of Leviathan. And the moment that Leviathan is not there, life becomes short and brutish. So we have to make sure that everything we do in this country, we do it as indicated in our constitution and as indicated in our laws. Now, these issues to do with what we are being treated to emanated from somewhere. We may decide to come up with a strategy that can contain the situation, or to come up with a strategy that can escalate the situation. Because as it is today, what we need to ask ourselves is that, is the strategy that has been developed by various law enforcement agencies working or not working, according to the indicators that are that we can see? Like, for instance, should we use a Kawangware case, the Kisumu case, to portray that the whole country is on fire? Should we use, should we now use the Kawangware case now to justify all other forms of countermeasures that are going to be undertaken in order to contain the situation? Remember, as we are talking now, there are those communities who believe that they are being profiled. And in fact, what I will urge the law enforcement agencies is to restrict themselves into their core functions. And their core function here, Mike, is not to punish offenders. Their core function is to apprehend. And if they cannot apprehend offenders, then what we need to ask ourselves, is it as a result of lack of capacity? And when I talk of lack of capacity, it involves so many other things. Lack of capacity can be lack of better equipment. Lack of capacity can be lack of training. Lack of capacity can be lack of enabling structure in order for them to apprehend the would-be criminals. Because I will expect a strategy that it's not aimed, because punishing an offender is a preserve of the courts, not a preserve of the law enforcement agency. And Mike, I will give you an example. In 1829, Robert Peel, through 1829 Metropolis Act, London Metropolis Act, came out with the Metropolitan Police. And in so coming up with the Metropolitan Police, he came up with 9 principles that he said these are the best principles that can guide any law enforcement agency across the world in the discharge of their duty, so that their relationship with the citizens are so close, in such that the citizens look at the law enforcement agencies as citizens in uniform, and the law enforcement agencies look at citizens as police without uniform. And I think the time has come in this country that the gap between the law enforcement agencies and the citizens needs to be reduced.
All right, let me come to you, sir. And there definitely is a history to how our law enforcement officers and, say, protesters treat each other. There's definitely a history to that. But could we be suffering from, 1, lack of training? And 2, do we get to hear the story from the law enforcement side? And by that I mean, if you went and even interviewed a policeman, they're not allowed to speak to cameras. They have police spokespersons who possibly are not in the battlefield. They are given feedback on what is going on. But when you're face to face with the protesters, or your life is in danger, maybe there are those rules of engagement that they're supposed to escalate. The first one may be possibly being verbal, telling people stop what you're doing, disperse, or go. Maybe there's those, you know...
Mike, before you go to him, one thing that we need to ask ourselves is that what should be the first line of defense on the side of the police officers when they are dealing with the rioters?
Yes, and that's what I want now to hear from you.
I think, Mike, the Constitution of Kenya is very, very clear that every citizen in this country has a right to freedom and security as provided by the national government. So there is no citizen who is spared from this. In actual fact, the issue of profiling should never, ever come up in terms of any discussion as long as somebody is a Kenyan citizen. And in fact, we even protect our friends from other countries. But our Kenyan citizens should always be protected by the law enforcer. In the case of the police in particular, of course, there are clear rules that the police officer is, and there's a very clear act, National Police Service Act, that defines the rules of engagement. However, in this particular case, there also is a change. You see, what happens is people then take the law into their own hands, which is why we're seeing some lawlessness, and say that I'm going out to picket or I'm going out to demonstrate. Under the rules, the policeman is not allowed to touch a demonstrator. He's not allowed to mess around with somebody who is picketing. As long as that person who is picketing within
the law,
the rule of law. But the minute that that individual then chooses to go and move into what we call civil disobedience, in other words, the destruction of life and property, which could also be the destruction of police officers' life. If somebody hurls a stone larger than the size of your head, Mike, at you from a 10-foot range, that person does not have your good in mind or at heart. That is no longer a normal demonstrator. So the policeman will then revert to taking action, not only to protect his own life, but also to protect the lives of his colleagues, because without them, then the indefensible citizen is the person who is going to suffer. So in this particular case, we're having this dynamic being replayed on, it's on playback, and we're keeping going into this circular reference about people who are coming out and saying we are demonstrating, and it's our right to demonstrate, and then turning into civil disobedience. So the number of cases of civil disobedience are actually what is bringing the problem. Now, Tuta has said something very important. Policing in general is a role not only for the police, but also for the general public at large. What do we mean when we say policing? Policing means that Nyumba Kumi should be working. That I should know that my neighbor is the guy who went and burnt the child somewhere down the road over there. You know, we should be able to know who are the people in this particular area who are holding illegal firearms. We should be able to know who are the people who are planning and calling for supplies and resources to go and instigate acts of violence. So policing should be where I am my brother's keeper. And I'm a good neighbor to say, look, there's an issue here, there's an incident there, and then we share this information, not only with the law enforcers, but we then protect ourselves. Because in failing to act, we are actually going to bring ourselves to a situation where we're undermining the nation. Now, as much as we are saying that there are isolated incidents, and we are saying Kenya as a nation, I think the bulk majority, more than 60% of Kenyans would simply like to go back to a normal day's work, have normal food, be able to pay school fees for their children, receive appropriate health care. There are a number of individuals who are saying and looking at this as an opportunity to take an advantage. And there is a diametric of our society that is looking at how can I take advantage of this situation to actually have personal gain? Very selfish interests. And that is where we're saying we need to analyze that. There is definitely 100% much more training required for our police.
Okay.
There is a lot more training that is not only required for our police services, but also for our leaders in general. And I think we also need to understand that communication, Mike, has been the biggest problem with the 2017 general elections. Because leaders assume that what they are saying in English is being broadcast and understood by the recipient in the same way. Or what they are saying in Kiswahili is being understood in the same way. You will understand that the psyche of different people, I can say something, I can say exactly the same words, but you hear something completely different. And in this particular case, our leaders are failing to communicate effectively. So, for example, when one leader comes out and says a particular thing, the followers then take it up, like what Tutu has said, and digest it and cause it to mean something entirely different. So we also need to look at that hand-in-glove strategy which is being deployed, where somebody is coming with a velvet glove, but then choking you at the same time.
Okay. All right, and we're running out of time now, so we need to conclude, and I need solutions. We need to know where we're going from here, because several incidences that have been quoted, for instance, Kawangware, and that could be dangerous if we use it as a litmus test by virtue of the fact that apparently there were certain buildings and businesses belonging to a community that were attacked, and this community then again retaliated. I mean, this would be literally taking this country to the dogs if that escalated. Solutions?
I think today you realize, Mike, that I'm just raising issues, yeah, as far as some of these, what we are being treated to in the country is concerned. We need to ask ourselves, suppose we reduce the threshold of the police using the force that they are using currently. We let compromise or enhance the security of the state. Will the police become now a toothless bulldog? And can the citizen understand? And with the reduction of the threshold or on the side of the police in terms of what they are supposed to do and what they are not supposed to do, will it influence the behaviors of the rioters in a particular way, either towards carrying out acts of crime or not to? The other thing that we need to look at, remember at the end of the day, also police are human beings. They have a right to protect themselves. But also individual citizens have got a right to be protected. But we need some of these allegations that has been raised about instances of police brutality to be investigated with the objectivities that they deserve, and to be investigated not communally, individual case, like for instance what we have mentioned about Bungoma. These are issues that need to be investigated, and they must be investigated in a manner that it's not going to compromise the police work. And in investigating some of these issues, what needs to be asked is the cui bono. What was the intention of the police officer in so doing what he did? Could it have been deliberately? Could it have been by default, or could it have been by design? Because we have also had cases whereby good security intention sometimes produces unlikely outcomes.
All right. Your closing
I think,
comments.
Mike, let's be very honest and clear as Kenyans. The reason we are in this situation is because there's an imbalance or a perceived imbalance. There are people who feel that they have not had a fair share of the pie. So big solution development agenda, youth employment. That's a very big solution. Typically, we should focus on areas that are disadvantaged, underdeveloped, and we should address the bottom layer of Maslow's hierarchy of need, providing food and security to the masses. That is one very big factor. Also, if we go back to the Supreme Court, if we go back to the IEBC, if we go back to the political parties, every single person is crying out, Constitution, Constitution, Constitution. If there's a problem with the Constitution, let's change it. It's the people's Constitution. Let's face it. Let's make the Constitution a better Constitution. At the end of the day, that's a solution. Now, number last is that we are not alone in having to deal with civil disobedience. It's a common trend around the world. If we are to take the example of Ferguson in the United States of America, which lasted for a very protracted period of time, what was deployed was the long-range acoustic device. There are non-lethal pieces of equipment that can kill civil disobedience within a matter of seconds, not even minutes. So it is important and imperative that the police be equipped. So we need to go back to the Exchequer, we need to go back to the National Security Advisory Council and say, what immediate measures and steps can we take to protect Kenyan lives? Because sometimes you need to be protected from yourself. Especially if you've become very antagonized about an issue, sometimes the policeman is there to protect you from yourself. Or else even from your community or from another community. So we need to really look at equipping the police properly. We need to look at proper training of personnel, but we also need to look at training of the masses. How do you behave in terms of a demonstration? What are the accepted norms? And also, I have not seen any single advertisement by the National Police. Hold on, Richard. Hold on, Richard. Hold on, Richard. Hold on. What we have not seen a single advert from the security agencies or the National Police Service, full-page ads or television ads that are saying, this is what you can do within a demonstration, this is what you cannot do. If you cross out of this line, we're going to deal with you. So we need to be able to see very clear communication. Again, communication is a very good strategy and a solution to the nation. So if we look at all these, last but not least, we need leadership. We need magnanimity, we need dialogue. We cannot have a situation where national leaders with a history of leadership in this nation cannot talk to one another. It's like a husband and wife saying we will never talk to one another again in this same house. That's wrong.
Absolutely.
I was just about to say that we can have all that what we have said. We can have good training for the police. We can equip them well. We can motivate them well. But again, after doing all that, we put them on shackles. Then they end up becoming Goliath on shackles again. So that as much as we're going to train them, as much as we're gonna equip them, then we should also allow them to perform what they have been trained, and we must also allow them to use the equipment that have been seconded to them.
And leadership, of course, being key in that whole scenario. Thank you, gentlemen, for joining us this morning. Delano Kiilu, who is the Secretary General for Protective and Safety Association of Kenya. We also have Tutor Richard, Homeland Security expert. Gentlemen, thank you for joining us this morning. This is Kivumbi 2017. It's now 4 minutes after 8. We take a short break, but do stay with us. We've got more news and reviews coming up right here.